Did you know that when Viggo kicked the helmet into towers, he broke his toe? Hi, I'm Lars. Welcome back to yet another, but slightly different, Lord of the Rings project. Our project plan is to make a diorama of the mighty sword Narsil. Well, that was actually Anduril, because when it got reforged no one cares. Now, I was going to recreate the exact set from the movies, but turns out that's already been done so many times. So we'll need to think of something slightly different. A forge master's job starts with breaking apart a geode to uncover the rich ore inside. Then starts the arduous process of folding the steel. As a base for the blade, I've sliced and baked a strip of clay, and because I'll definitely mess this up, I've also made some backups.
Let this be the hour when we draw swords together.
That's a great idea, Mr. T. I'll start with marking out the center line and width of the blade, then finish it off with a perfectly executed rendition of the stabby end. I'll start the end bladening process by sanding it most of the way down, before another great demonstration of my total inability to draw straight lines. The ensmithing process is an arduous back and forth between scraping with a scalpel and sanding. For the final stretch of free ASMR, I made a few little sanding tools by gluing different grits of sandpaper to small pieces of wood for a flatter surface. At some point, I did forget that I'm still working with brittle clay, and my repeated abuse ended up prematurely dislocating the stabby end of the sword. But luckily, just like the Rivendell elves, I was able to use a bit of super glue to reforge the blade.
It is a gift.
The last detail on the blade is what I've learned from Pocket Forge on Instagram is called a fuller. If you like swords and other tiny stabby bits, you should definitely check him out. He makes tiny weapons too, but unlike this one, his are actually good and made out of actual metal because unlike me, he is not a coward, afraid of hurting his little fingies or angering his overly aggressive smoke detector. With that done, our blade is forged and ready for the next step. Breaking it. Sorry Lonk, but we do actually need to turn this long sword into a stubby digit removal tool. But in this economy, I can't afford to hire my own Dark Lord to do the work for me, so I'll have to do it myself. As the clay ended up being more brittle than I had planned, I won't be able to get all the parts from this blade, but I can get about every other piece. The remaining bits I'll just have to make separately. I'll fillet the blade with plenty of extra spare meat per piece, then use the scalpel again to slowly carve away the excess while constantly being absolutely terrified of breaking the pieces in the process. Even an idiot knows you shouldn't touch a sword blade directly, so we'll need to make a hilt for it. The armature for the hilt itself is a bit of some copper tubing I had lying around, and the guard bit that stops your fingers from falling off is made by performing a bit of sexy cherry stem tongue magic on a bit of copper wire that gets glued into place. Adding the clay is a finicky process at this scale, and it does look pretty rough even after a lot of smoothing and tooling, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to tighten everything up in the end with a bit of more scalpel and sandpaper work. I'll bake each part as I do them to make sure I have something to hold on to as I work on the rest. It also makes it easier to blend the parts together without ruining what we've already done. I'm trying to get as much of the movie prop detail in there as I can, but this is so tiny that my clumsy sausage fingers can only get so granular with it. With something resembling the pommel and whatever these side nubs are called, I can throw a bit of Hylian magic into the mix and get it all attached to the rest of the handle. For the handle grip ribs, I've rolled out strips of clay on the pasta maker's thinnest setting, wrapped the strips around the baked handle, and then slicing them into the right width and length. I can then glue the bottom blade bit to the handle, first 6 times in the wrong place or angle, before getting it somewhere adjacent to correct. Now all I need is to blend the blade into the handle and add the last details. and our sword model is done and ready for
metal.
I'm having a lot of fun doing these projects and would love to do a lot more of them, so if you also want that, please leave a like and let me know in the comments. Me and whatever Skynet robot controls YouTube at this point. Now, if you watched other videos in the past and enjoyed them and would like to support the channel, the best way to do so is by subscribing, as well as spreading the word to anyone else you know who might enjoy this mess. Thank you so much for watching, and please enjoy me slowly descend into insanity for the rest of the video. As I said, my original plan was to cast the sword in real metal, but in my cowardly shame, I had to figure out a different approach. I did find a few people using this specific line of metal airbrush paints that over a glossy black base coat seemed to make for a pretty mirror-like chrome finish. Since I don't necessarily want to adamantium my own human body, I need to attach the sword fragments to something for when I spray paint them. I sanded down the tips of these wooden skewers, glued them to the backside of the fragments, and set up my high-end spray booth. I primed them with the glossy Tamiya black off camera, so now all I need is a few spritzes of the chrome paint lacquer. Now, it might be hard to see on camera, but the result is actually pretty good compared to just plain old acrylic metal paints. If the surface itself was smoother, I think you could get this stuff pretty mirror-shined. The last step to getting our Gondorian cocktail skewer looking more realistic is to give the handle a layer of dark grey, staining some of the metallic nooks and crannies with a dark wash, then highlighting the metal edges with a brilliant silver and the handle with a bit of lighter grey, and the sword is officially done. My blood freezes as it is, once again, time for me to go up against my arch nemesis,
Epoxy resin.
I hate you so much.
Cast it into the fire!
I wish I could, Agent Smith, but to satiate my hunger for views, I must instead cast it into this mold I made from acrylic sheets. In my long-standing tradition of trying to be smart, but only making things even worse, I'm testing pre-taping all the joints to make the mold less likely to leak. After the mold is sufficiently cube-shaped, I'll go over every seam with a thick layer of silicone spackle to close off any possible escape route. Having at least learned something from all my previous resin debacles, I actually remember to try applying mold release this time. I did do it off camera, but I can assure you it looked very cool and exciting. I'm going to have to do this pour in layers, both to avoid any runaway exothermic reaction due to the thickness, but also because I need a layer to put the sword bits on to have it appear suspended in the center of the cube. Now, as with most things I do, there are probably way smarter ways of doing this, so feel free to shame me in the comments if you're a seasoned resinier shaking your head so hard right now you're giving yourself a migraine. After the mandatory turtle jazz fingers have been performed, it's time to set it aside for a few days and wait for it to get thick enough to support our sword bits. And by a few days, I meant about an hour because this thing is already leaking. It seems to be my overly optimistic tape joints that are the main culprits, so after trying to cobble together a makeshift containment frame, I put the half-full epoxy can on top to weigh the walls down and hopefully close any gaps between them and the bottom sheet. I also made a mark on the side of the mold so that I'll be able to see if any more has leaked out over the next couple of hours. It's been about a day and a half, and so far it's looking pretty good, except for the fact that my big brain tape idea ended up trapping a bunch of tiny air bubbles. It should, however, now be hard enough for me to stick my sword bits onto. I have to make sure it sticks to this layer though, and doesn't just float to the top of the next batch of epoxy after we pour it, so I figured that using a bit of UV resin should do the trick, and should hopefully end up being basically invisible inside the surrounding epoxy when it's done. Now, I wasn't able to get the hilt part to stick well enough, so I opted to super glue it onto the epoxy. I have read that some epoxies can have a reaction to super glue, but surely that's the other epoxies, not mine. So the epoxy did have a very unexpected reaction to the glue, which will hopefully not be that visible under another layer of epoxy. In a rare moment of foresight, I did submerge a test piece into some resin to see if the paint would be affected, and boy was it, just the slightest touch and we're straight back to the black primer. To get around this new fun wrinkle, the only thing I can think of is to give every piece a layer of gloss varnish to protect it from the epoxy. Now, the bottle says to let it dry for 24 hours, so as the law-abiding citizen that I am, let's do that, and then we should be ready for layer 2 of resin. I really like how this is looking, and the paint job looks really good in the resin. It's so nice to finally have a project go right for once. Oh, piss, the whole sword is covered in tiny bubbles. Luckily, the resin still seems pretty liquidish, so maybe I can just stick a soft brush down there and just like brush the bubbles away. The lacquer just brushes right off. You can also see that in a lot of places it is straight up being eaten away. I have to go do something else for a bit. Since our stupid cube of stupid resin will need to be seated in something, I'll need to build an appropriate looking enclosure. This will also serve to hide the shoddy electronics crimes I'll be committing here in a little while. While I'm not going to sculpt the statue in the OG shot, I do still want to pull in some of the set design, and I landed on these column types. I'll build them around these column-shaped bits of wood, and for the end caps I'll return to my trusted paint stirring sticks, glued together into these little platforms. After gluing it all together, I also added a couple of stir stick cross brackets in the back for something to drape the clay for the back wall across. I'll bulk out the bottom with a bit of aluminium foil, before starting to dress these wooden pigs in their respective clay blankets. The blocking out and detailing of the columns consisted of adding and blending in strips of clay and detailing them to a combination of the best of my ability and or patience. Mostly the latter. To achieve the decorative lampshade look for the bottom half, I started by gifting it this clay snake necklace, then rubber tooling it into sections. After spending way too much time carving and ball stylizing the ridged pattern into it, all I need to do is copy pasta everything over to the opposite side. After closing the curtain on the back window, I think the stone needs a more stony texture. I'm currently out of actual stones, so I'll have to settle for the crafting world's second best type of rock. As soon as the whole base has been adequately foiled, I'll brush it down with alcohol to smoothen everything out, before adding a last pass of cracks and chips. Now, the aforementioned electrical crimes will need a shelf to rest on because of gravity, if you believe in that kind of stuff, so I brutally rammed a piece of acrylic through the back wall, creating a slot for it in the sides of the inner walls. With that done, it's baking time. Since the sculpt job itself now has a good amount of geometrical detail, we can go for a pretty uncomplicated paint job. After a darkish gray base coat, I'll use a torn up makeup sponge to dab on some lighter and darker shades of the same color for a bit of breakup, before applying a gradually brighter dry brush to bring out the edge detail. Okay, I guess at some point we will have to deal with this mess again, which at this stage is somehow looking even worse. It seems that once again, my arch nemesis has straight up destroyed me.
Resin wins. Fatality.
As you all yelled at me for forgetting mold release last time, I did remember it for this one, so I'm expecting the mold walls to fall right off with just a baby's breath of force. So while some parts did come off a lot easier than last time, there are still some areas that I must solve the only way I know how to solve any problem, hitting it real hard with a hammer. So I'm not sure what went wrong this time. Maybe it was just too little mold release, or maybe I applied it wrong. I don't know. Any mold makers out there in the audience, please help me. As soon as the cube is disrobed, I can go over the sharp edges with an X-Acto knife. It is hard to concentrate on what to do with these tape lines when all I really want to do is sort my collection of toenail clippings. I'm just kidding, I would never have a collection of toenails on my desk like this. I'm not a savage. I keep those in a jar on my bedstand like any normal person. To diffuse the light from our future LEDs and to warm up my sanding arm for the big game, I'll start off by giving the acrylic shelf a rough sanding. The epoxy cube also needs to be sanded down after we took it to X-Acto Town. It has nothing to do with the fact that the more I do it, the less I see of the sadness inside. Inside the cube, that is. After having produced enough lung cancer powder, I'll just have to give it a quick wipe of alcohol to... Oh god, I can see it again. Oh, thank you. It's gone now. It can't hurt me anymore. Having learned last time that putting the thing directly on the table when pouring the top coat is not a great idea, I decided to build a little raft to lift it slightly. After mixing another batch of depression syrup, I can slowly just pour it. Oh god, no, there it is again.
Go back to the shadow.
What this cube of Udun does not know is that as the wielder of the Flame of Honor, I can attack it with fire.
You have no power here.
Well, at least I have one power that works, DC power. Or AC, not totally sure how batteries work. Now, I haven't soldered anything since the FNAF video back in, oh god, that was like March.
It's been 84 years.
This part is always exciting, as the possible side quests are many. Will I accidentally huff the smoke and fall into a 7-year coma? Will it sneak its way out of the office and set off the whole building's fire alarm? Or maybe I'll fall into that coma, come out of it in 7 years, then find out I did the connections wrong and the LEDs won't light up at all. Who knows? The final step is to skillfully add some shrinkable tube socks to protect my connections. Let one of them fall off and forget to put it back on before soldering the other end to the battery holder. At this point, I no longer had the emotional fortitude to check if the lights actually work, so we will just have to wait until beauty shot day to see. Now that all the parts are made, we can finally start putting it all together. Unsurprisingly, it's not a perfect snug fit, and it does take me a couple of tries to get it in, as I keep breaking off little chunks of clay that you would be able to see through the epoxy. With better planning, I could have designed the base in such a way that I could have just cast the resin straight into it, which would have both resulted in a better looking end result and saved me a ton of work. Though the backside of this thing isn't suited for human eyes, I do have to go back here one last time to get the LEDs installed. After the acrylic shelf is in place, I'll insert the orange LED on one side and the blue one on the other. Now I'll end up mostly using just the blue light, as the combo turned into an inappropriately sick esports purple. Now all that is left is to savor one last gaze at this flawless engineering work, and we are ready to see if I'm a good enough lighter to save these beauty shots. Thank you so much for coming along on this project. If this is your first time here, welcome aboard. The bar is stocked to the gills with nerdy art stuff and like all the memes for you to enjoy. Now, if you're a returning viewer, don't tell the new kids, but I do love you a little bit more. Now, this project was a handful, but I did take away a ton of lessons that I hopefully remember some of for future projects. And I hope you'll be here for those as well. It just wouldn't be the same without you. I'll see you again soon, and remember, make a mess and build cool stuff.